Forms. Normally, when we're creating a graphical user interface, we don't imagine a flowchart or maybe a process logic with gates, gateways, system activities, or integrations. But nowadays, most systems that are striving to offer good usability, they consider all the interactions that are carried out on a screen. These are considered as interface processes. So the same as we have to learn how to create a class of process with its diagram and all of its different steps, we also need to learn how to create interface processes. Sometimes it can be even much more complex to define an interface process than to create an automated process. After all, the hardware and the software that we're using is only going to complain about performance, but people are going to be much more demanding. So they want everything to be logical, they want it to be comfortable, they want it to be nice, they want to have a good experience. So here we have a very simple example. We've all tried to log into a system on an application, and we've used a login form. And we might think, well, that's easy. That's just one interface where you just type in a user and a password. But there's a lot behind it. For example, what happens when you forget your password? It has to take you to another interface. Besides from this interface, you're supposed to be able to go back to the previous one, and you should also be able to send your email for, to receive a password recovery message. Besides, there's more possible interfaces that you might see. Maybe if you try to log in, it might tell you your password is incorrect or the login is incorrect, or it might take you, if you've done everything correctly, it might take you to your employees portal or your external portal. So there's all these different steps and all these different connections between all of these different interfaces, and we have to learn how to do this correctly. Nobody likes to fill in a form, so now we're going to see several best practices that are going to make it a little bit better, a bit more pleasant for the user to fill in the form. So we're just going to see some basic rules. We're not going to go a lot in detail, but at least the main rules that we should know in order to design forms. First of all, we should avoid visual contamination. Less is more. We don't have to be afraid of leaving white space. It's very annoying when we see a very cluttered website or a very cluttered form with all kinds of information. This was something that used to be done in the 90s. We used to go to a website and we see all these GIFs moving around and all these, hundreds of things here and there. And nowadays we're seeing that most companies, what they're trying to do is offer very clean interfaces, very minimalistic interfaces with just the minimal required options so that you can perform your actions, your activities. For example, a nice example of this would be the Google search engine, where all I have basically is a place where I can type in some text and search, because that's basically what I want to do on that page. Another thing we want to do is not to ask users for information we don't really need or we could actually have automatically. Here we have an example in this form where I'm asking for the name and the surname. If the user is already logged in, I should fill in these fields automatically. I shouldn't be asking the user to give this information to me. The less restrictions, the better. So here we have an example where we're asking the user to give us their address. And this is a little bit choppy and chunky for the user. It's quite difficult. First, they have to indicate their street, then the number, the door, the province. We could probably just leave a field that's called address and they can just type in the entire address here. Or maybe we might want to divide it into a few, but not that many. So we want to try to add the less restrictions, the better. We should also try to avoid optional fields or requesting for personal or unnecessary information. If we want personal data, we always have to make sure the user knows why we're trying to ask him for this information. For example, if I'm asking for a birthday, we'll at least tell them, look, on your birthday, we're going to send you a discount card or maybe a promotion or something like that. We should try to make it simple and clear for the user. We should offer them help with external tools, but preferably we're never going to kick someone out of our form. So we always want to keep all the information on our form. Here we have an example where the user can indicate their delivery schedule and they can also check the schedules. We don't want to send them to an external document or an external page to check the schedules. But anyways, this has been done in this form, but if we can avoid that, we would also try to avoid that. We also have to be very careful with the alignments, the margins, and we have to leave enough space between the fields. This is going to make a big difference between a scrappy design and a very professional one. So now we've already fixed some of these issues, but we still have a lot of work. So we can see this form, and there's still room for a lot of improvement. For example, whenever we can, we're going to use a single column. This way we can prevent the eye from zigzagging unnecessarily. Maybe we can't do this because it's a very complex format and we need users to input a lot of data. But if possible, we're going to do that. Besides, we should try to use left alignments if possible, at least in most countries like, I don't know, in Europe or in America where people read from left to right. Obviously, if we're in the Middle East, we're going to want to do the other, build our forms the other way around. So we also recommend putting the fields labels above the field because it's much easier for the eye to read downwards than to have to go zigzagging and looking for the information in this other way. If we need to enter a lot of data into a form, it's quite convenient to create several steps or group the data or the related fields under certain titles. For example, here we have all the shipment details like the street, the address, the city. We could actually create a title and try to group all of this information or create a step for this, for the user to input this information. The same thing we could do with this information over here. If we can, we should try to avoid as many clicks as possible. So here, for example, if it's gender, male, female, well, why don't we put 2 radio up buttons, instead of having to click on this drop down list and then click again to select the option. So it would be much more convenient to just directly display all the different options on the form. The length is also very important. For example, here we can see a field that's called zip code, and maybe we only have to input 5 or 6 digits. So it would be interesting to make this field a little bit smaller. Or maybe, let's say it's an email field and we don't want our email to be chopped off. So we have to make sure it's large enough for an entire email to appear in this field. So we have to take into account the length of these fields. In some scenarios, we're just going to want to keep them all the same. So they're all going to have the same length, but in certain scenarios, we might want to adjust the length of these fields to help the user understand what he has to input in the field. For example, let's imagine I have a field that's called score, and the users might think they have to input maybe text like high, low, medium, or something like that, when actually what we want them is to just input a numeric value from 1 to 10 or something like that. So this, let's say creating a field with all this space wouldn't be very interesting if what we want is a numeric value. Another thing we have to be very careful with is to not use elements that compete for the user's attention. We have to highlight what the user is going to act or they're going to be using more frequently with. Everything else should have less contrast. For example, here in this form, it's very obvious that we don't want the user to always be deleting the form. So why do we want to pull all their attention towards this button here that has much higher contrast than this one over here? Basically, what we want to do is give more contrast to those options that we want the user to see even better. This is called call to action. We'll talk about it in a moment. We also want to define a very clear hierarchy. We want to use font sizes, weights. We want to use things correctly so that the user knows what's a title, what's a description, what's the label of a field. For example, here it's very difficult for me to know that this is a title, that this is a label of a field, that this is the content of the field, or that this is a description because there's no hierarchy in this form. We also have to be very careful with spelling mistakes or poorly structured sentences. So here we can see an example where it says our schedule and it's not written correctly. I'm sure most of you guys are already realized when we started seeing this slide. But anyways, sometimes we don't review the text or I don't know, we leave some bugs. They might not be, system bugs. They might just be bugs like a wrong label and things like that. But it's very important to create professional solutions. This is going to give a very poor example of what we're capable of doing. Here we can see an example where all of these bugs have been fixed. So we can see we've clearly established a hierarchy using size fonts and other elements. Here, for example, we've added a background, a grayish background for the title and for the footer. So we're very clearly defining these 3 different spaces. We've got the header, the body, and the footer. We're also preventing the user from entering the wrong data. We're giving them examples. For example, here in the birth date, let's say I start typing the date and the first thing I type in is the year. Well, if I don't want the user to do that, I should give them an example of what would be the correct way of inputting data into this field. We're also avoiding sending users to other places. For example, here, we decided to just put the schedule directly, the two different options. So you can decide whether you want to receive something from 8 to 2 in the afternoon or from 4 to 8 in the afternoon. Besides, we were reducing the clicks to the maximum. So here, gender, we can see the two options are displayed. Besides, we're displaying everything vertically. That's interesting because the eye of the user is going to read here personal data. It's going to go down here to birthday. Then it's going to fill in this field. Then it's going to also see this information here. It's going to go to gender. Here it's going to select one of the options. So basically, we're going straight down. We're not forcing the user's eyesight to get strained or stressed while they're trying to fill in this form. This is something most users might not even notice, but actually they do. And maybe at the end when they fill in the form, they don't really like it, or they feel annoyed about it, or they feel that the experience isn't very good. They might not even know why, but that's a general feeling they're going to have after filling in the form if it's not correctly designed. We're also offering information so that the user knows our intentions. So here we're telling the user, hello. Instead of displaying a label of a field and putting name, we've actually converted this into information that's addressed to a person, to a human person, like, adding a phrase, hello, David, to make the shipments, you must provide some information. If you tell us your birthday, we're going to send you a gift or whatever promotion. Besides, the tab order works correctly. So each time I tab between fields, it's going to jump from one field to another in a correct order. We're also using images or icons that help the user understand. This isn't mandatory, but it is a good option when we want to help users understand what they're going to be doing. For example, here we have a paper bin. It is very important that these images are very relatable, or it's very easy to understand that this is an action, a deleting action. How can users know this? Well, basically because they've already used hundreds or thousands of apps out there that have the same icon that does the exact same thing, or because it's something that very clearly in the real world very clearly identifies what we're trying to do. What we're never supposed to do is use icons that have nothing to do. Let's imagine here I have a star and I want to click delete. Why would I ever put an icon of a star here? It doesn't make sense. The user, it's just going to confuse them. It's going to be annoying. So we have to stick to what we know, or to what everyone is doing. We also are going to be using a clear call to action. For example, here we can see the delete button. It's not competing for attention with the send button. So basically, all the attention of the user is being sent to where we want him to go. So first he's going to read this here. This is calling a lot of attention. And besides, usually in most countries, we're reading from left to right and from top to bottom. So this would be the first bit of information we're seeing. Then we see these two different blocks of information that are grouped by these large labels. And then finally, we're seeing this clear call to action where we want the user, once he's finished the form, we want him to click the button send. In conclusion, it's essential that a user understands what is going to happen in every step they take. And if necessary, we need to offer logical and personalized warnings. We're never going to use generic warnings such as error or incorrect data and things like that. And even worse yet is when we don't offer information at all. So if the user is going to lose all of his data, we have to make sure to add a confirmation window and tell them, watch out, you're going to delete all of the data. Or when someone finishes a form, we're not just going to want this window to disappear. We're going to want to offer him some information like, okay, your registration was submitted successfully, or something that allows him to know that nothing went wrong. It's not an internet problem. It's not his browser's problem. It's not that he just lost all the information. If we give him information, they're going to have a much better experience. So let's say we're going to hire someone to automate our processes. And after the implementation, we're finding spelling mistakes, we're finding different inconsistencies or awful readability, like this text here. It's terrible to read. It's yellow text on top of red. So would we actually hire the services or this person again? We have to keep in mind that whatever we're building here is going to be the image of the company. There's going to be a lot of users who are going to be consistently working with this day after day. So we have to be very careful with these type of best practices. Exercise 401, Part 2.